Hello, my name is Graham Wilson, and today I want to inform you about electrification of vehicles and how it relates to Canada's energy system. First, we're going to discuss what electrification is in regards to reducing Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. Then we'll discuss the environmental impacts of electric cars in particular. And finally, we'll take a look to see if Canada's electric grid can currently support electric cars. To first understand electrification, we need to look at where we typically get energy. Fossil fuels and electricity are just two forms of energy. Typically, directly burning fossil fuels results in a lot more greenhouse gas emissions than electricity. So, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we can make things that used to be powered by fossil fuels powered by electricity. This is called electrification. If electrification is done on a big enough scale, we can significantly reduce the amount of fossil fuels we use and lower our overall greenhouse gas emissions. Electric vehicles are one example of electrification, and it's the one we'll be discussing today. To find out the impacts of electric vehicles, let's first look at Canada's overall emissions. Currently, greenhouse gas emissions due to transportation make up 24% of Canada's emissions, but some of these emissions are from things that electric cars don't relate to, like air travel. Emissions due to passenger vehicles in particular are 11%. Generally, passenger vehicles are the easiest to electrify, so these are the emissions we'll be discussing today. But the question is, how much of these emissions can we eliminate by using electric cars? To find out, let's take a look at the emissions of vehicles using different power sources. This chart shows the operating greenhouse gas emissions due to gas vehicles on the left, as well as electric cars powered by various sources of electricity. We can see that nuclear and hydropower result in a 99% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and even natural gas, a fossil fuel, still results in a 50% reduction in emissions. On the other hand, an electric car powered only by coal electricity results in only a small reduction, if any at all. So, we can see that electric cars have varying potential depending on where you get your power from. So, where does Canada get its power from? Fortunately, Canada's overall electricity mix is very green. As shown on the graph on the left, 60% of our power came from hydroelectricity in 2015 and another 15% from nuclear. On average, switching to an electric car in Canada would result in a 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but this number could be as little as 15% or as high as 95%, depending if you come from a province that uses mainly green electricity or is more dependent on fossil fuels. Using the 75% reduction, and knowing that our total passenger vehicle emissions were 11% of Canada's emissions, that means that we can reduce about 8% of Canada's overall greenhouse gas emissions by switching to electric cars. Based on this, we can conclude that yes, electric cars can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now we know that electric cars can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so let's look at how they do or don't fit into the electrical grid. Let's consider a scenario where 30% of British Columbia's cars are electric, which will result in approximately a 10.5% rise in electrical demand. To see if the electrical grid can support this, let's take a look at a typical British Columbia day. Without electric cars, we can see that overnight demand is low, and during the day it peaks at around 8 gigawatts of power. For reference, BC Hydro owns about 12 gigawatts of power capacity, so we have a bit of room to play around. Generally, a utility wants to see a very flat demand curve so that they can turn their generators on and let them run all day. Turning power plants on and off to match peaks and valleys is difficult and more expensive. Now, let's assume that everyone plugs their cars in at the same time after work. This is far from ideal. We're still technically within BC Hydro's capacity, but we're uncomfortably close to the limit. We'll likely have to build more power plants, and since we need to turn them on and off quickly, electricity will probably cost more too. This is called uncoordinated charging, and it's a worst case scenario for electric cars. It's expensive, and it might make electrifying cars a big challenge. Fortunately, there is an alternative. Let's consider coordinated charging. Assume everyone has their cars on smart chargers. So when they plug them in, the cars don't actually start charging until later. Now, instead of making the peaks bigger, we've actually flattened out the whole curve. Additionally, if we have a lot of solar or wind power, we can turn the smart chargers on when it's windy or sunny, and we can actually make it easier to accommodate the renewable energy on the grid. So, in conclusion, we can say that yes, the grid can support electric cars if we put a little bit of planning into it. In summary, we looked at how electric cars could reduce transportation emissions by 75% in Canada, and reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions by 8%. We also saw that this could be done without needing to overhaul the electrical grid, and discovered that it might even allow for us to add more renewables to the grid, further reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it helped you understand how electrification works in regards to electric cars.